HOA. President destroyed my elderly mom's home, unaware I'm rich enough to buy them out. My mom is 72 and has lived in the same modest house for over 40 years. It's a simple 3-bedroom home in a quiet suburban neighborhood that she and my late father bought when they were first married. The neighborhood wasn't anything fancy back then, just working-class families trying to build a good life. But over the years, as the area developed and property values rose, things started to change. About 5 years ago, some developers bought up several empty lots in the area and built a bunch of expensive homes. That's when the HOA was formed. At first, Mom didn't want to join, but they basically forced all existing homeowners to become members, claiming it was for community improvement and property value protection. I offered to buy her a new house somewhere else, but she refused. This was her home, filled with memories of Dad, and she wasn't going anywhere. See, what the HOA didn't know about me was that I'd done pretty well for myself. I'm a tech entrepreneur who sold my company for a ridiculous amount of money a few years back. But I keep a low profile, drive a regular car, and don't flash my wealth around. Mom raised me to be humble, and those lessons stuck. The problem started when the new HOA president took office. This guy was the epitome of everything wrong with HOA: power-hungry, greedy, and completely lacking in empathy. He started implementing all these ridiculous rules about house appearance, lawn maintenance, and community standards. My mom tried her best to comply, but it was hard for her. She's elderly and lives on a fixed income. I offered to help, but she's stubborn and proud, just like Dad was. I can manage just fine, she'd tell me whenever I offered financial assistance. The harassment started small. First, it was notices about her non-regulation mailbox. Then complaints about her outdated house paint. The HOA president would drive by slowly in his luxury car, taking pictures and sending violation notices for the smallest things. I started getting concerned calls from Mom more frequently. "Honey, they're saying I need to replace all my windows with their approved style. That'll cost thousands," she told me one day, her voice shaking. "Mom, let me help. I can easily afford it," I insisted. No, I don't want to be a burden. I'll figure something out." But then things got worse. Much worse. One day, Mom called me in tears. "They're saying my house is bringing down property values. The president just told me they're going to force me to sell if I don't make all their demanded upgrades immediately." I was furious. "What upgrades? Show me the list." She sent me photos of their demands. New roof, new siding, new windows, landscaping overhaul. The total would have been well over $100,000. It was obvious what they were doing, trying to force out the older residents who couldn't afford their ridiculous standards. I immediately called the HOA president. "This is my mother's house you're harassing. She's lived there for 40 years. These demands are unreasonable." "Listen," he said condescendingly, "we have standards to maintain. If your mother can't afford to keep up with the community requirements, perhaps she should consider moving somewhere more suitable for her means." The way he said it made my blood boil, but I kept my cool. "I'm warning you now, leave my mother alone. You don't want this fight." He actually laughed. "Is that a threat? I don't know who you think you are, but we have every right to enforce our standards. Your mother has 30 days to comply, or we'll begin legal proceedings." I hung up and immediately called my lawyer. Not a regular residential attorney, but the high-powered firm that handled my company's merger. I explained the situation and told them to spare no expense in protecting my mom's interests. But before they could even file anything, the HOA made their fatal mistake. Mom called me early one morning, absolutely hysterical. "They're here with bulldozers. They're saying they have the right to demolish the house because it's a community hazard. They won't even let me get all my things out." I jumped in my car and raced over, but by the time I got there, it was too late. They had already knocked down half the house. The HOA president was standing there with a smug smile, watching as my mother's home of 4 decades was destroyed. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted, rushing to comfort my sobbing mother. "Enforcing our bylaws," he said, waving some papers. Your mother's house was declared a hazard, and we have the right to remove it, she was warned. I looked at the paperwork he was holding. It was completely fraudulent. They had forged building inspector reports and falsified documents to justify their actions. That's when I decided to show them exactly who they were dealing with. First, I got my mom a suite at the nicest hotel in town and made sure she was comfortable. Then I called my team of lawyers and told them to unleash hell. I want everything, I told my lead attorney. Check every document, every permit, every penny that's passed through this HOA's accounts. Find out who owns what and how much they owe. I want to know every skeleton in their closet. What's your end game here? He asked. I'm going to buy the entire HOA out from under them, and then I'm going to make them pay for what they did to my mother. Within hours, my legal team discovered the HOA president and his board had never even filed proper permits for the demolition. The hazard declaration was completely fabricated. They had committed multiple crimes, including destruction of property, fraud, and forgery of official documents. I immediately filed for an emergency injunction to stop any further demolition and had my security team posted at the property to prevent them from touching anything else. The HOA president tried to have them removed, but the police confirmed my right to protect my mother's property. Then I started digging into the HOA's finances. What we found was astounding. The president and his cronies had been embezzling funds for years. They had been collecting excessive fines from residents and pocketing most of the money. They had also been taking kickbacks from preferred contractors who overcharged for community maintenance work. But I wasn't just going to turn them in. No, I wanted them to feel the same helplessness they'd inflicted on my mother. I had my team quietly approach each homeowner in the development. We offered to buy their properties at 20% above market value, with the option for them to stay as renters at below market rates if they wished. The only condition was complete secrecy until we had majority control. The HOA president had no idea what was happening until it was too late. In just 3 weeks, I had purchased over 60% of the properties in the development. Under state law, that gave me controlling interest in the HOA. I called for an emergency HOA meeting. The president strutted in like he owned the place, probably thinking he was going to hand out more violation notices. The look on his face when my lawyer stood up and announced the change in ownership was priceless. "What is this?" he demanded. "You can't do this." "Actually, I can and I did," I replied, standing up. "As the majority property owner, I'm calling for an immediate vote to remove the current board and install new management." He turned pale. You're just trying to intimidate us. We have rights." "Rights?" I laughed. "Like the rights you gave my mother when you illegally demolished her home? Speaking of which..." I nodded to my lawyer, who started handing out documents to everyone present. These papers detail the criminal complaints being filed against the former board members for embezzlement, fraud, and destruction of property. The police are probably at your homes right now with search warrants. The president tried to run for the door, but 2 police officers were already waiting there. They led him away in handcuffs as he shouted threats and obscenities. But I wasn't done yet. After the meeting, I approached each board member individually. I laid out their options. They could cooperate fully, resign from the board, and pay restitution for their part in the scheme, or they could face criminal charges and civil lawsuits that would bankrupt them. One by one, they crumbled. Each confession revealed more corruption than the last. They had been targeting elderly residents throughout the community, hoping to force them out so developers could build luxury homes. With the old board gone, I immediately got to work fixing things. First order of business: rebuilding my mother's home. But I didn't just rebuild it, I had it reconstructed exactly as it was, down to the smallest detail, using photographs and Mom's memories. I even had her old wallpaper patterns custom reproduced. The contractors worked around the clock. In just 2 months, Mom's house was ready. When I took her to see it, she burst into tears. "It's exactly the same," she whispered, touching the familiar walls. "Even the little crack in the kitchen tile that your father always promised to fix." I had also retrieved as many of her possessions as possible from the rubble, and had experts restore what could be saved. Her photo albums, Dad's old armchair, the china cabinet they bought on their 10th anniversary, we managed to save more than she thought possible. But I wasn't finished with the HOA president yet. Remember those criminal charges? Turns out he had been running similar schemes in other communities. Once investigators started digging, they found evidence of fraud going back over a decade. At his sentencing hearing, he tried to play the victim. The judge wasn't having it. You preyed on elderly residents, destroyed homes, and stole from the very community you were supposed to serve, the judge said. I'm sentencing you to 8 years in prison and ordering you to pay full restitution to all your victims. The restitution came to over $2 million. He tried to declare bankruptcy to avoid paying, but my lawyers were ready for that too. We had already placed liens on all his assets and properties. As for the HOA itself, I completely restructured it. The new bylaws explicitly protected elderly residents and put strict limits on the board's power. Any major decisions now required a 75% vote from all residents, not just board members. I also set up a community assistance fund to help older residents with home maintenance and repairs. No one would ever have to choose between buying groceries and paying HOA fines again. The other board members didn't fare much better than their president. Between criminal charges, civil suits, and having to pay back their stolen funds, most of them lost everything. One tried to skip town, but my private investigators tracked him down in Mexico and had him extradited back to face charges. Mom's case made national news, sparking investigations into HOA abuse across the country. Several states even passed new laws strengthening oversight of HOA and protecting homeowner rights. These days, Mom is happy in her rebuilt home. The neighborhood is peaceful again, with none of the harassment and intimidation that had become routine under the old board. The former HOA president writes her letters from prison sometimes, begging for forgiveness. She just throws them away without opening them. I still own majority interest in the HOA, but I let the residents manage their own affairs as long as they follow the new bylaws. The community is actually thriving now that people aren't living in fear of arbitrary fines and harassment. Recently, Mom hosted a neighborhood barbecue in her backyard, something that would have earned her a violation notice under the old regime. As I watched her laughing with her neighbors, serving her famous potato salad and telling stories about the old days, I knew every penny I spent taking down that corrupt HOA was worth it. Sometimes people ask if I went too far, if I couldn't have handled things some other way. I tell them about Mom standing in the ruins of her home, watching strangers destroy 40 years of memories because they thought she didn't fit their vision of the community. Then I ask if they think I went far enough. The lesson here isn't about money or power. It's about standing up to bullies who think they can prey on those weaker than themselves. Sometimes justice needs deep pockets to work properly, but it's not about the money. It's about using whatever resources you have to protect those who can't protect themselves. Update: 2 years later, the former HOA president just got released early. And karma wasn't done with him yet. A lot has happened since I last posted about taking down the corrupt HOA that destroyed my mom's house. I figured you all might want to know how things turned out. First, my mom is doing great. Her rebuilt home looks exactly like it did before, but now with some modern upgrades I snuck in, better insulation, a security system, and some subtle accessibility features for when she needs them. She pretends not to notice, but I catch her using the hidden grab bars in the bathroom sometimes. The former HOA president got released early for good behavior after serving just 3 years. He immediately tried to cause trouble. This guy just doesn't learn. 2 days after his release, he showed up at Mom's house. Luckily, I was visiting that day. He started ranting about how we'd ruined his life and demanding we drop the restitution order against him. The security cameras caught everything, including him trying to force his way onto the porch. "You don't understand," he yelled through the door. "I lost everything because of you people." I called the police while Mom just sat calmly in her favorite chair, not even bothering to acknowledge him. When the cops arrived, they found him still shouting and causing a scene. Turns out showing up at your victim's house and making threats is a parole violation. Back to jail he went. But here's where it gets really interesting. Remember those investigations his case sparked? Well, they kept digging and found similar schemes in 3 other states. The FBI got involved because it crossed state lines. They're charging him with racketeering now. He's looking at another 10 to 15 years minimum. His wife finally divorced him and wrote a book exposing even more of his crimes. Apparently, he'd been running these HOA scams for over 20 years. The book is actually pretty good. Mom keeps a copy on her coffee table just to spite him. The other former board members aren't doing much better. The treasurer who tried fleeing to Mexico? He's still in jail, but now he's trying to make a deal with prosecutors to reveal even more corruption. The vice president had to sell her luxury home and move in with her kids. She works at a dollar store now. Karma's funny that way. But it's not all negative. The neighborhood has completely transformed. Remember that community assistance fund I set up? It's helped 12 elderly residents fix up their homes so far. We even added a small community garden where neighbors can grow vegetables together. The new HOA board is amazing. They actually focus on helping people instead of harassing them. Last month, they organized a neighborhood-wide effort to help an elderly couple repair their roof after a storm. Everyone pitched in, even the fancy homeowners who used to look down on the older residents. My lawyers keep finding more victims of the former president's schemes. We've helped recover over $5 million in stolen funds so far. Every time he tries to hide assets, we find them. He'll be paying restitution for the rest of his life. The story got picked up by a major news network, and they're doing a documentary about HOA abuse. They interviewed Mom for it. She was reluctant at first, but she decided it was important to speak out. The producer told me her interview made the crew cry. I just want other people to know they don't have to be victims, she told them. Stand up for yourselves. There's always someone willing to help if you look. Remember that judge who sentenced the HOA president? She's now leading a state commission on HOA reform. They're drafting new laws to prevent this kind of abuse from happening again. Mom testified at their first public hearing. The wildest part? Some of the former president's victims from other states have started a support group. They meet online every month to share stories and help each other recover from the trauma. Mom joins sometimes to offer encouragement. She's become something of a hero to them. Last week we had another neighborhood barbecue. The contrast to the old days couldn't be more stark. Kids were playing on the lawn, neighbors were sharing food and laughing together, and not a single person was measuring grass height or taking photos of violations. One of the newer residents asked Mom what the neighborhood was like in the old days, before all the drama. She just smiled and said, "It's better now than it's ever been." Sometimes things have to break completely before they can be fixed properly. The former president's latest appeal was denied yesterday. His lawyer quit after that, saying he's impossible to work with. He tried representing himself at the restitution hearing. It went about as well as you'd expect. The judge actually laughed when he claimed poverty while wearing a $5,000 watch. I've had people ask if I regret spending so much money and time on this fight. Not for a second. Mom called me yesterday just to tell me she'd planted flowers in her front yard, something the old HOA would have fined her for. The joy in her voice was worth every penny. These days, when potential homebuyers tour the neighborhood, they're told up front about what happened. Most are impressed by how the community came together and reformed itself. Our property values have actually increased because people want to live in a place where neighbors look out for each other. The former president still writes letters sometimes, usually demanding things or making threats. We don't read them anymore. Mom just adds them to a scrapbook she's keeping. Evidence for the documentary, she says. I check in on Mom more often now, though she insists she's fine. Last time I visited, I found her teaching the neighbor kids how to make her famous chocolate chip cookies. The same neighbors who, under the old regime, weren't allowed to play in front yards or make excessive noise. My lawyer called this morning with news that they'd found another hidden account of the former president's. more restitution money for his victims. He never learned that his greed would be his undoing. So that's where things stand now. Mom's happy, the neighborhood is thriving, and justice continues to be served. The documentary airs next month. They're using Mom's story as the centerpiece, the grandmother who took down a criminal HOA empire. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just winning the battle, it's completely changing the game so bullies can never play again. Mom taught me that. Well, that and always keep your receipts. You never know when you'll need them to take down a corrupt HOA president. The next one is titled, The Thin Red Dime, Don't Come Back Home. I've written many MCs about my adult life, teaching, running a drive-through, you name it. Though I've referenced growing up with my father, this is the first time I've written about him directly. There has to be a statute of limitations on speaking Isle of the Dead. If these balls could talk. Anyway, I'm about 11 years old in Germantown, the projects of Quincy, Massachusetts, living with my father. Anytime I've asked about my mom, I got shot down with she's a crazy idiot. My father had many vices. Tobacco seemed to play the biggest role in our lives and in keeping him relatively sane. Cigarettes lined up like a Clash of Clans skeletal army, warding off the much bigger, much more formidable beasts that lie ahead. Individually, a cigarette holds minimal power, yet 1,000,000 times more power than none. This sad mathematical fact is what brings us to this story of the most malicious of compliances. When my dad ran out of the money he got for SSI and SSA, cigarettes became a problem, even in the late 80s. He would have me bum cigarettes from the neighbors. Some neighbors were generous. Some told me how vile it was for a father to send their child to get cigarettes. Some threw chicken bones at me. If I only had the wherewithal to reply, "Ma'am, I'm 11," or at least duck. When it got really bad, he had me walk the town looking for cigarette butts that still had some tobacco left. This was a disgusting activity that I eventually got really good at. And really sick of. One night he sends me off on another tobacco mission, but I'm in the middle of a game of Monopoly. I'm playing with Chewbacca, Starscream, and Megatron, and it's about to get good. I argue to the point of my dad throwing a handful of shit #tie coins at me, yelling in his raspy post-thyroidectomy voice, "Don't come back until you have cigarettes I can smoke." Enter MC. As blood trickles down my face, dripping onto a few dirty coins I managed to retain from their violent travels, I wonder what other crimes these coins have been complicit to. What have you done, little dime? I was done. With all of it. As an 11-year-old I had very little cards to play, but one of them landed right in my lap. I walked in the dead of night, directly up the unnamed dirt road my dad used to drive me down while sitting on the hood. Back when I was a few years younger. When I was his type. Am I ready to do this? I keep walking, seeing many cigarette butts and even an uncrushed pack, ignoring them all as I walk to the fire station. I know there's a payphone there, and this time my dad's gonna pay. I look down at my coins, my bloody dime, and call my Aunt Stella. She told me earlier this year that any time I needed help, call her. My dad always insisted I don't do this, or ever call her for anything, because all she wants to fucking do is rat me out and see me in jail so she can keep you. Sounds like a plan. When she picked up she knew right away, but explained in way too much detail what happened the last few months and then years, even including the essay from my dad back when he was still into me. If these balls could talk. Anyway, I cried and tears well up even now remembering how it all just flowed out of me like a river of garbage falling over me. I knew this was gonna be big trouble if I didn't have the cigarettes, and I told her. She risked her life driving to us, pack of cigarettes in her hand as she picked me up and told me to stay in the car. Even through the closed windows of a Chevy Nova, I could hear her yell, "Here's your fucking cigarettes, I'm taking up." The saddest Sata was that he took the cigarettes and turned around, no argument. He didn't even fight for me. I don't even know why, to this day, I even wanted him to. Aunt Stella did what I knew she would, call the cops on him and take me in. He went to jail, then eventually out of state, after kids kept coming out of the woodwork who were his victims. I never looked back. Who am I kidding? I looked back every day since.